They say no one leaves Ashcroft Castle unchanged, but Clara Whitmore arrived with nothing left to lose and far too much to fear. The rain came down in relentless sheets, soaking through the thin wool of her coat as she stood before the towering iron gates, her gloved hand trembling against the cold metal latch. Behind her stretched miles of empty road, swallowed by darkness, and ahead loomed the castle, stone and shadow, its windows dim like watchful eyes that had forgotten warmth. She had walked nearly 3 miles after the carriage abandoned her at the fork, her boots slick with mud, her breath shallow from the cold, each step driven not by hope, but by the simple refusal to disappear quietly into the night. When the gates groaned open under her push, the sound echoed too loudly in the stillness, as if the place itself resented her intrusion. Clara hesitated for only a second before stepping through, her heart pounding hard enough to drown out the wind. The path curled toward the main doors, lined with bare trees that clawed at the sky, their branches rattling like whispers she couldn't quite understand. By the time she reached the entrance, her fingers had gone numb, but she forced them to rise and knock. Once, twice, each strike swallowed by the storm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened just enough to reveal a man's silhouette, tall, unmoving, his presence filling the frame with quiet authority. Sebastian Ashford did not step forward. He simply looked at her, his gaze sharp and unreadable, as though weighing whether she belonged to this world or should be turned back into the night. Clara lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in restraint, gathering the last fragments of dignity she had left. "I won't ask for long," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Just until the storm passes." The wind surged behind her, cold and insistent, carrying with it the truth she did not speak, that there was nowhere else to go. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression, too subtle to name, gone as quickly as it came. He opened the door wider, stepping aside without a word. The warmth inside did not reach her. Immediately, it lingered somewhere deeper within the castle, beyond the long corridor that stretched ahead like a silent test. As Clara crossed the threshold, water dripping from her coat onto polished stone, she felt it. The shift, the quiet closing of something unseen behind her. The door shut with a final, echoing click, sealing her inside a place where grief had settled into the walls and time itself seemed to hold its breath. She did not know then that this was not merely shelter. It was the beginning of something that would change them both. And somewhere, beneath the weight of silence, the castle seemed to notice her. The corridor stretched longer than Clara had expected, the sound of her damp shoes echoing softly against the polished stone as she followed several paces behind Sebastian Ashford, who did not once turn to see if she kept up, his stride measured and effortless as though he had walked these halls 1,000 times without ever noticing them. The air inside the castle held a quiet chill that no fire seemed to fully chase away. And though candlelight flickered along the walls, it only deepened the shadows instead of warming them, casting long shapes that moved like silent observers as she passed. A woman in a dark uniform appeared from a side passage, her expression composed but her eyes briefly widening at the sight of Clara, taking in the soaked coat, the travel-worn dress, the undeniable truth that she did not belong here. And yet she said nothing, only dipping her head toward the Duke as he spoke in a tone low and controlled. "Prepare a room in the east wing," he said, not slowing his pace. "Something suitable." The woman nodded once and disappeared, leaving Clara with the strange sensation of being both seen and dismissed in the same breath. They reached a wide staircase, its banister carved from dark wood polished to a mirror sheen, and as Clara placed her hand upon it, she felt the cold seep instantly through her glove, as if the house itself held no memory of warmth. Halfway up, her gaze caught on something along the wall, a portrait, or rather, what had once been one, now covered entirely by a length of black fabric that hung with careful precision, concealing whatever lay beneath. It was not the only one. As she climbed higher, she saw more, each frame shrouded the same way, each presence carefully erased, yet somehow more noticeable because of it. "You may remain until the storm passes," Sebastian said at last, his voice breaking the silence without softness, as if he were stating a rule rather than offering kindness. Clara lifted her eyes, meeting his profile rather than his gaze. "Thank you," she replied, the words simple but steady, refusing to let gratitude sound like surrender. He stopped at the landing then, turning slightly toward her, and for the first time the distance between them felt measured, deliberate. His eyes lingered on her face, not with curiosity, but with something closer to assessment, as though he were trying to understand why she stood there so composed when everything about her circumstances suggested she should not be. "You will find what you need," he said, though it sounded less like assurance and more like a boundary. Clara nodded once. "I always do." The answer came before she could soften it, and for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, not quite disapproval, but enough to suggest she had stepped outside whatever expectation he had formed of her. Footsteps approached from behind, and the same woman returned, this time with a lantern in hand. "Your room is ready," she said, her tone respectful, though her gaze flicked again toward Clara with quiet scrutiny. Clara followed her down another corridor, leaving Sebastian standing at the landing, his presence lingering even as distance grew between them. The room she was shown into was larger than anything she had known, the bed neatly made, a small fire already burning in the hearth, its glow casting soft light across polished furniture and heavy drapes drawn tightly against the storm outside. For a moment, Clara simply stood there, the silence pressing in, the unfamiliar comfort almost more unsettling than the cold had been. She removed her gloves slowly, her fingers still trembling, not from the weather now, but from the weight of being somewhere she did not understand. As the door closed behind her, the faint echo seemed to carry through the walls, as though the castle itself had taken note of her arrival and was waiting, not for her to leave, but for something else entirely. Clara did not sleep as deeply as she had expected, despite the warmth of the fire and the softness of the bed, because the silence of the castle was not the kind that brought rest, but the kind that listened. Sometime in the night she woke without knowing why, her breath shallow as she stared into the dim glow of dying embers, the room too still, as though even the air had paused, and it was then she noticed the faint sound beyond her door. Not footsteps, not quite, but something quieter like fabric brushing against stone or a distant door closing somewhere deep within the walls, a reminder that she was not alone in this place, even if it felt that way. By morning, the storm had not lessened, and the sky beyond the heavy curtains remained a dull, endless gray that pressed against the windows like a weight. Clara rose early, more out of habit than necessity, dressing in the same clothes that had barely dried overnight, her fingers moving with practiced care as she smoothed each crease, as though order in small things might steady what she could not control. When she stepped into the corridor, she found it empty, the long stretch of polished floor reflecting the pale light of morning candles that had already been replaced, though she had not heard anyone pass. The castle seemed to move around her without ever revealing how. She followed the faint scent of tea and bread until it led her to a smaller sitting room, where a tray had been set near the window, untouched but clearly meant for her, and for a moment she hesitated, uncertain whether accepting it would mean stepping further into a place she did not belong. But hunger and exhaustion overruled doubt, and she sat, her movements quiet, as though she might disturb something unseen. The tea was still warm, the bread fresh, small details that spoke of care without presence, and Clara found herself wondering who had arranged it, and why it had been done without acknowledgement. It was not kindness in the way she understood it, but something more restrained, something that did not ask to be noticed. As she finished, her gaze drifted again to the walls, where more covered portraits hung in deliberate silence, their shapes unmistakable beneath the dark fabric, and she felt a strange pull, a question forming that she could not ignore. Rising slowly, she stepped closer to one, her hand lifting before she could stop herself, fingers hovering just above the cloth, close enough to feel the faint coolness of it, as though whatever lay beneath still held the chill of memory. "You should not touch those." The voice came from behind her, low and even, and Clara turned at once, her hand falling back to her side as Sebastian Ashford stood in the doorway, his presence as composed as it had been the night before, though there was something sharper in his gaze now, something that suggested he had been watching longer than she realized. "I was only looking," she said, her tone calm, though her pulse had quickened. He stepped into the room, the distance between them closing with quiet precision, his attention lingering not on the portrait, but on her, as if weighing not the action, but the intention behind it. "There are many things in this house that are not meant to be seen," he replied, and though the words were measured, they carried a finality that left no room for argument. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer than expected, not in defiance, but in quiet understanding, as though she recognized the boundary for what it was, not a rule of the house, but a reflection of something far more personal. "Then perhaps they are not meant to be hidden forever," she said softly, and the silence that followed was not empty, but charged, as though the castle itself had paused to listen to what would come next. The silence did not break after her words. It deepened, settling between them like something alive, something that had not been challenged in years. Sebastian Ashford did not respond immediately, and that absence of reaction carried more weight than anger ever could. His gaze fixed on Clara with a quiet intensity that suggested she had stepped too close to something he had long since buried beneath control and routine, and yet he did not turn away. "This house is not concerned with what should be," he said at last, his voice even, though something beneath it had shifted, a tension that had not been there before. "Only with what is." Clara lowered her eyes slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as though she understood that this was not a conversation he was willing to continue. "Not here, not now." "Then I will remember that," she replied, her tone measured, careful not to press further, though the question lingered between them like a shadow that refused to fade. He gave a small nod, the gesture restrained, almost dismissive, and yet he did not leave immediately, his presence remaining in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, as if something held him there against his better judgment. It was Clara who moved first, stepping back from the portrait, creating distance where tension had begun to gather, and the moment passed, though not entirely undone. The rest of the day unfolded in quiet fragments, each hour marked not by conversation, but by the subtle rhythms of a place that functioned without revealing itself. Clara was shown the main corridors she was permitted to use, guided by the same woman from before, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Dalton, her manner polite but distant, as though familiarity was neither expected nor encouraged. "You will find the library at the end of the West Hall," Mrs. Dalton said, her voice steady as they walked. "The dining room is prepared at set hours. If you require anything, you may inform one of the staff." Clara nodded, taking in each detail, though it was not the directions that occupied her thoughts, but the way every door they passed seemed closed, every space carefully defined, as if the castle itself existed in sections that did not wish to overlap. "And the East Wing?" Clara asked quietly, recalling the room she had been given. Mrs. Dalton paused just slightly, the smallest hesitation, but enough to be noticed. "That wing is reserved," she said, her tone unchanged, though the answer felt incomplete. Clara did not press. By late afternoon, the storm outside had grown heavier, the wind pressing against the tall windows with a force that made the glass hum softly, and though the fire in the library burned steadily, the warmth felt contained, unable to reach beyond the immediate circle of light. Clara found herself there without quite deciding to go, drawn perhaps by the promise of quiet that felt less watchful than the rest of the house. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with books that had not been touched in some time, their spines worn but orderly, and she moved among them slowly, her fingers trailing lightly across the edges as if reacquainting herself with something familiar. It was here that she felt it again, that subtle shift, the sense of being observed not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity, and when she turned, she found Sebastian standing near the doorway, his presence as silent as the house itself. "You seem to find your way easily," he said, his voice quieter now, less guarded, though no less controlled. Clara met his gaze, the flicker of candlelight catching in her eyes. "I learned long ago that unfamiliar places are easier to understand than people," she replied, and for the briefest moment, something in his expression softened, not enough to be called warmth, but enough to suggest that her words had reached somewhere he had not expected. Outside, the storm continued without mercy, but within the walls of Ashcroft Castle, something else had begun, something neither of them had yet named, and neither of them was prepared to face. The library did not feel as empty the second time she stood within it, though nothing had changed in its arrangement. And yet Clara could not ignore the quiet shift that followed her now, subtle but undeniable, as though the castle had begun to recognize her presence rather than merely tolerate it. Sebastian remained near the doorway, his posture composed, but his attention no longer distant, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching in a way that felt less like absence and more like something waiting to be understood. "You read?" he asked at last, his voice carrying a quieter edge than before, less guarded, though still measured. Clara turned slightly toward the shelves, her fingers brushing lightly along the spine of a worn volume before pausing. "When I have the chance," she replied, lifting the book carefully as though it mattered, as though everything in this place demanded a certain respect. He watched her, not the book, not the movement, but the way she held herself, steady despite the unfamiliar surroundings, and something in that steadiness unsettled him in a way he did not expect. "Most people find this place difficult," he said, the pause between words deliberate, as though he were choosing them with care. Clara met his gaze again, the faintest hint of something thoughtful in her expression. "Most people expect warmth when they enter a house," she answered quietly. "This one does not pretend to offer it." The honesty of it lingered, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in his eyes, not offense, but recognition, as though she had named something he had stopped acknowledging long ago. He stepped further into the room then, the soft sound of his footsteps grounding the moment. "You speak as though you understand it," he said, not accusing, but not entirely neutral either. Clara lowered her gaze slightly, not retreating, but choosing her words with the same care he had shown. "I understand what it is to live somewhere that remembers more than it forgives," she replied, and the weight behind her words did not demand explanation, yet it left a mark all the same. For a moment, Sebastian said nothing, and the silence that followed was different from before, less distant, more aware, as though something unspoken had been acknowledged between them. He turned away first, his attention shifting toward the far end of the library, where a tall cabinet stood partially hidden in shadow. "There are rooms here that have not been opened in years," he said, his tone returning to its usual control, though something quieter remained beneath it. "It is easier that way." Clara watched him, the way his gaze avoided certain corners, the way his presence seemed to carry both authority and restraint, and she understood then that the house was not the only thing holding its breath. "Easier does not always mean better," she said softly, the words leaving her before she could consider them, and the moment they did, she felt the shift again, sharper this time, like the tightening of something unseen. He turned back to her slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes no longer distant. "You have been here less than a day," he said, his voice low, not harsh, but edged with something firm. "And already you question what has kept this place standing." Clara did not step back, though everything in her situation suggested she should. "I do not question what holds it up," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension between them. "Only what it costs to keep it that way." The words settled heavily, and for a moment, even the fire seemed to quiet, its crackling reduced to a faint whisper against the stone. Sebastian held her gaze, and in that stillness, something shifted, not breaking, not yet, but bending in a way that could not be undone. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the windows, but inside the library, something far quieter and far more dangerous had begun to take shape, something neither of them could yet turn away from. The moment did not break, but it did not hold forever either, and when Sebastian finally turned away, it was with the quiet decisiveness of a man who had long practiced ending conversations before they could reach places he refused to revisit. Clara remained where she stood, her hand still resting lightly against the edge of the book she had chosen, though she no longer felt the need to open it, because something else had already begun to unfold within these walls, something that demanded more attention than printed words ever could. "You should rest," he said without looking back, his tone returning to the controlled distance that defined him, as though the previous exchange had not shifted anything at all. "The storm will not pass soon." Clara inclined her head slightly, accepting the dismissal without resistance. Yet when he moved toward the door, she spoke again, not loudly, but with a quiet certainty that carried further than it should have. "Storms rarely do," she said. He paused, just briefly, his hand resting against the frame of the doorway, and though he did not turn, The stillness that followed acknowledged her words in a way his voice did not. Then he left, and the library settled back into silence, though it no longer felt untouched. The hours that followed moved slowly, marked by the soft fading of daylight into early dusk, the gray sky beyond the windows deepening into a muted blue that never quite reached darkness, as though the storm itself refused to release its hold. Clara wandered the corridors with quiet purpose, not searching for anything specific, but observing, learning the rhythm of a place that revealed itself only in fragments. She noticed how the staff moved with careful efficiency, their voices low, their presence fleeting, as if they too understood that the house required a certain kind of restraint, and she noticed something else as well, something small, but impossible to ignore. In a narrow hallway near the east wing, where the light seemed thinner and the air carried a faint trace of something older than dust, she found a small table placed beneath one of the covered portraits, and upon it rested a single object, a music box, its surface worn with time, its delicate hinge slightly tarnished but intact. It was not placed for display, not arranged with intention, but left there as though forgotten, or perhaps deliberately untouched. Clara hesitated only a moment before reaching for it, her fingers brushing lightly across the lid before lifting it open with care, and for a brief second, nothing happened. Then the mechanism caught, and a soft melody drifted into the quiet, fragile and uneven, as though it had not been heard in years, the notes trembling slightly, but still recognizable, still holding something that refused to fade entirely. The sound filled the narrow space, gentle but insistent, and Clara felt something shift within her, not from the melody itself, but from the weight of what it represented, a piece of the past left in plain sight, yet never acknowledged. She closed the box slowly, the final note lingering in the air before dissolving into silence, and when she turned, she was no longer alone. Sebastian stood at the far end of the hallway, his expression unreadable, but his stillness sharper than before, as though the sound had reached him long before she realized he was there. "That should remain closed," he said, his voice low, not raised, but carrying a quiet authority that did not need to be enforced. Clara held the music box gently in her hands, her gaze steady despite the tension that had returned, stronger this time, more defined. "It was not meant to be forgotten," she replied, her tone soft, but unwavering, and for a moment, something in his expression faltered, not breaking, not yet, but shifting in a way that could not be undone. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if crossing that distance required more than he was willing to give, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, but filled with everything neither of them had said, everything that now stood between them, fragile and inevitable all at once. The distance between them did not close, yet neither of them stepped away, and in that narrow hallway, with the faint memory of music still lingering in the air, something fragile and unspoken tightened between Clara and Sebastian, as if the past he had sealed away had found its voice again through her hands. He did not reach for the music box, though his gaze never left it, and when he spoke, his voice carried a restraint that felt far more deliberate than anger. "You do not understand what you are disturbing," he said, each word measured, controlled, as though anything less would fracture something he could not afford to lose. Clara held the small object carefully, her fingers steady despite the weight of his attention. "Then perhaps it should not be left where it can be found," she replied, her tone soft but unwavering, not challenging him, but refusing to pretend the truth was invisible. The silence that followed stretched longer this time, deeper, and for a moment, it seemed as though the walls themselves leaned closer, listening. Sebastian exhaled slowly, a quiet release that carried more fatigue than frustration, and at last, he stepped forward, closing part of the distance but not all of it, as if proximity itself demanded a cost. "It was not forgotten," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "It was left, because some things are easier to endure when they remain untouched." Clara's gaze softened slightly, not with pity, but with understanding that did not seek permission. "Untouched does not mean unchanged," she said, and though the words were gentle, they settled with a quiet finality that neither of them could ignore. For a moment, something shifted in his expression, not enough to be called vulnerability, but enough to suggest that her presence had begun to press against the edges of something he had long kept sealed, and before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the stillness, sharp against the stone floor, purposeful and unhesitating. Both of them turned, and the interruption arrived not as chance, but as something far more deliberate. A woman entered the corridor with quiet confidence, her posture impeccable, her expression composed in a way that spoke of familiarity with power rather than deference to it, her presence immediately altering the atmosphere without a single raised voice. "I was told the storm had delayed visitors," she said, her tone smooth, carrying just enough curiosity to suggest that she had already formed her own conclusions. Her gaze moved to Clara, lingering for a fraction longer than politeness required, taking in every detail with careful precision before returning to Sebastian. "It seems the house has decided otherwise." Sebastian's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, the subtle shift of a man stepping back into a role he had not fully relinquished. "Lady Vivian," he acknowledged, his voice returning to its usual composure, though the air between them held something more restrained, more guarded. "Your arrival was not expected." The woman inclined her head slightly, a gesture that balanced courtesy with quiet assertion. "Unexpected things have a way of revealing more than planned ones ever could," she replied, her attention drifting once more toward Clara, not openly hostile, but far from welcoming. Clara felt the weight of that gaze, the quiet assessment that did not need words to make its meaning clear, and yet she did not lower her eyes, did not retreat into the role that might have made this moment easier to navigate. Instead, she stood still, the music box still held gently in her hands, as though she refused to become invisible simply because someone expected her to. Lady Vivian's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest recognition of something she did not entirely approve of. "And who," she asked, her tone light but deliberate, "might you be, to stand so comfortably within a place that has never been known for its hospitality?" The question lingered, not seeking an answer, but demanding one, and in the quiet that followed, it became clear that the storm outside was no longer the only force pressing against the walls of Ashcroft Castle. Clara did not answer immediately, not because she lacked words, but because she understood that anything spoken too quickly would be taken and shaped into something she did not intend. And so she held Lady Vivian's gaze with a quiet steadiness that did not seek approval, nor did it offer apology. The silence stretched just long enough to shift the balance of the moment before she spoke. "I am someone who needed shelter," she said at last, her voice calm, measured, carrying no more than the truth she chose to reveal. Lady Vivian's expression did not change, but something sharpened behind her eyes, a subtle recognition that Clara had not stepped into the role expected of her, and that deviation alone was enough to make her presence unwelcome. "Shelter," she repeated softly, as though tasting the word, weighing it against something unseen. "How fortunate that you found it here." The tone was light, but the implication beneath it was not, and Clara felt it clearly, the quiet suggestion that her presence was an intrusion dressed as necessity. Sebastian's voice cut through before the tension could settle further. "Miss Whitmore will remain until the roads are passable," he said, his tone controlled, leaving no room for interpretation, and for the first time since Lady Vivian had entered, there was a hint of something else beneath his composure, something closer to resolve. Lady Vivian turned her attention to him fully, her posture unchanged, but her gaze more direct now, more searching. "Of course," she replied smoothly, though the faintest pause suggested she had not expected that answer to be given so firmly. "The storm does seem persistent." Clara lowered her eyes briefly, not in retreat, but to steady herself against the shift that had just occurred, because she understood what had not been said, understood that Sebastian's words had not simply explained her presence, but had, in a quiet way, placed her within his authority, and that carried a weight she had not asked for. Lady Vivian stepped closer, her movements graceful, deliberate, her attention returning once more to Clara, though now it lingered with a more defined purpose. "You must find this place quite unusual," she said, her tone conversational, though every word felt carefully chosen. "It has never been known to welcome strangers." Clara lifted her gaze again, meeting the question without hesitation. "It does not welcome," she said softly. but it does not turn away either. The answer hung in the air, simple, but layered in a way that could not be easily dismissed, and for a moment, even Lady Vivian seemed to consider it more closely than she intended. Then, slowly, her lips curved into something that resembled a smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "How interesting," she murmured, her attention shifting briefly back to Sebastian, as though reassessing something she had already believed she understood. The tension did not dissolve, it settled, becoming something quieter but more enduring, something that would not fade with the end of the conversation. And as Clara stood there, the music box still resting in her hands, she felt the shift clearly, not just in the room, but within the fragile balance of the house itself. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the windows, the wind rising with a force that rattled the glass. But inside, something else had begun to move, something far more controlled and far more dangerous, because it did not rely on force at all, only on perception, on judgment, on the quiet decisions that would determine who belonged within these walls and who did not. The moment did not dissolve after Lady Vivian's faint smile. It sharpened, settling into something quieter but far more deliberate, and Clara felt it in the way the air seemed to shift, as though every word spoken now carried consequence beyond the immediate exchange. Sebastian stepped forward then, not abruptly, but with quiet authority, his presence repositioning itself between the two women in a manner that appeared natural, yet left no question as to where his attention had settled. "The corridors grow cold in this wing," he said, his tone even, though it carried an unmistakable finality. "We should continue this conversation elsewhere." Lady Vivian inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the suggestion without resistance, though her gaze lingered on Clara for a fraction longer than courtesy required, as if committing something to memory. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "It would be a shame for our guest to find herself uncomfortable after such a fortunate arrival." The word lingered, soft, but not without intent, and Clara felt it settle against her like a quiet challenge, one she did not answer, though she did not look away either. As they moved toward the main corridor, the distance between them shifted once more, not physically, but in a way that defined position and perception, and Clara understood with a clarity that surprised her that she had crossed from unseen to observed, and that change would not easily reverse. The dining room was already prepared, the long table set with careful precision, candlelight reflecting softly against polished surfaces that spoke of order rather than comfort. And as they took their places, Clara became aware of the quiet attention that followed her, not from those present alone, but from the unspoken expectations that seemed to linger within the room itself. Lady Vivian seated herself with practiced grace, her posture flawless, her movements unhurried, as though time adjusted to her rather than the other way around, while Sebastian remained composed, his attention divided between courtesy and control. Clara sat where she was directed, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her presence steady despite the unfamiliar weight of the setting, though she could not ignore the subtle shift in atmosphere, the way every small detail seemed to carry meaning beyond itself. "You must forgive my curiosity," Lady Vivian said after a moment, her voice calm, almost pleasant, though the precision beneath it remained. "It is not often that Ashcroft receives visitors under such unusual circumstances." Clara met her gaze, the flicker of candlelight steady in her eyes. "There is nothing to forgive," she replied quietly. "Circumstances rarely ask permission before they change a person's path." The answer settled into the space between them, simple, but not without depth, and for a brief moment, something in Lady Vivian's expression shifted, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement that Clara's words carried more than surface meaning. Sebastian did not speak, though his attention did not waver, and Clara felt it, not as pressure, but as something more restrained, more deliberate, as though he were listening for something beyond what was said. The meal proceeded with quiet formality, conversation moving in measured currents that never fully settled, each exchange revealing just enough to maintain politeness, but never enough to dissolve the tension that had taken root. And as the hours passed, Clara became aware of something else, something subtle but undeniable, the way Sebastian's attention returned to her, not openly, not in a way that could be easily named, but in brief moments, in pauses that lingered just slightly longer than necessary, in a quiet awareness that had not been there before. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was no longer distance either, and Clara felt it with a clarity that unsettled her more than Lady Vivian's scrutiny ever could, because it was not judgment, but something far more dangerous, something that suggested change, and in a place like this, change was never without cost. The final course had long since been cleared, yet the weight of the evening remained, lingering in the quiet spaces between movement and breath, and as Clara rose from her seat, she felt the subtle shift of attention follow her once more, not just from Lady Vivian, but from Sebastian himself, whose silence had become more revealing than any question he had not asked. The room emptied with practiced efficiency, the staff moving like shadows retreating from candlelight, leaving behind only the faint echo of formality that no longer held its shape. "You carry yourself with unusual certainty," Lady Vivian remarked as she stood, her tone light, though her gaze remained fixed on Clara with quiet precision. It is not often one sees that in someone with so little claim to it. The words were gentle in delivery, but their meaning settled sharply, and for a moment, the air between them stilled, as though waiting for Clara to falter. She did not. "Certainty is not given," she replied, her voice calm, steady, untouched by the edge beneath the statement. "It is learned when there is nothing else left to rely on." The response lingered, and though Lady Vivian's expression did not change, something within it tightened, not with anger, but with recognition that Clara would not be easily placed into the role expected of her. Sebastian's gaze shifted between them, not intervening, yet no longer distant either, as though he had become aware of something unfolding that he could not entirely control. "The hour is late," he said at last, his tone measured, though there was a quiet insistence beneath it that did not invite disagreement. "Miss Whitmore should rest." It was not a suggestion. Clara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the dismissal without resistance, though as she turned to leave, she felt it again, that quiet pull, not from the room, but from the man who remained within it, his attention following her departure in a way that could not be explained by courtesy alone. The corridors seemed longer on the return, the candlelight dimmer, as though the castle itself had withdrawn slightly after the evening's exchange, and when Clara reached her room, she closed the door with careful precision, leaning against it for just a moment, her breath steadying as the silence returned. It should have felt like relief. It did not. Instead, the quiet pressed closer, filled now with something unsettled, something that had shifted beyond her control, and as she moved toward the small window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the storm still raging beyond the glass, she understood that the world outside had not changed, but the one within these walls had begun to. Hours passed without sleep, the fire reduced to low embers, the room dim except for the faint glow that refused to fade entirely. And somewhere in that stillness, Clara made a decision, not sudden, but inevitable, shaped by everything she had seen, everything she had felt, and everything she had not yet been told. She could not remain here longer than necessary. Not because of Lady Vivian, not because of the whispers she had already begun to sense, but because something far more dangerous had begun to take hold, something that did not rely on force or circumstance, but on quiet recognition, on the slow and undeniable shift of attention that had begun to form between her and the man who ruled this place. And if she stayed, even a little longer than she should, she feared it would not be the storm that kept her here, but something far harder to leave behind. Clara rose before the first hint of morning, though the sky beyond the window had never truly darkened enough to mark the passing of night, and the storm still pressed heavily against the glass, its steady rhythm the only measure of time she could trust. The decision she had made did not feel sudden, nor did it feel uncertain, but it carried a quiet weight that settled into every movement as she dressed with careful precision, smoothing each fold of fabric as though the act itself might steady what she could not say aloud. The room no longer felt unfamiliar, and that was precisely the reason she could not remain. She moved to the small writing desk near the hearth, where a single sheet of paper had been left, along with a pen and ink that had likely been placed there without thought, part of the quiet order that governed the house, and she hesitated only briefly before sitting, her fingers resting lightly against the surface as she gathered the words she would leave behind. It was not a letter of explanation, nor of apology, but something simpler, something that carried the clarity she had come to rely on. She thanked him for shelter, for the unspoken kindness that had not been named, and for the understanding that had begun to form in the spaces between silence. And though the words were measured, they held more than courtesy. They held an ending she had not expected to feel so deeply. When she finished, she folded the page neatly, placing it where it would be seen, not hidden, not concealed, because this was not something she wished to leave unfinished. The corridor outside remained still as she stepped into it, her footsteps soft against the stone, the early hour ensuring that no one crossed her path. And yet she felt it again, that quiet awareness, as though the house itself had begun to recognize the shift that was taking place, the departure that had not yet occurred but had already begun. She did not return to the main halls, did not pass through the rooms that had already begun to hold traces of her presence, instead choosing the narrower passage that led toward the east wing staircase, the path she had first taken upon arrival, though now it felt different, not unfamiliar, but altered by everything that had happened since. As she reached the lower level, the faint glow of lantern light revealed a figure already awake, Mrs. Dalton standing near the entrance hall, her posture composed, though her gaze held something more observant than before. "You are leaving," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement. Clara inclined her head slightly. "Before the storm settles," she replied, her voice steady, though the words carried more than their surface meaning. Mrs. Dalton regarded her for a moment longer, as though weighing something unseen, before stepping aside, her gesture small, but deliberate. "The gates will open," she said softly, and though there was no further comment, the absence of resistance felt more significant than any farewell. Clara moved toward the door, her hand pausing briefly against the cold metal handle, and for a moment, the silence behind her pressed forward, not as something that held her back, but as something that marked what she was choosing to leave behind. She did not turn. The door opened with a low, echoing sound, the wind immediately rushing in to meet her, sharp and unyielding. And as she stepped out into the storm once more, the distance between herself and the castle began to take shape, though something within her remained, quiet and unresolved, as though part of her had not yet followed the path she had chosen. Inside, the letter rested where she had left it, the ink still fresh, the words waiting not for explanation, but for recognition, and in the stillness of the room above, something had already begun to shift, though the man it belonged to had not yet realized what he was about to lose. The storm had not weakened when Sebastian Ashford entered the east wing later that morning, though something else had shifted within the walls long before he crossed the threshold. He did not notice it immediately, not in the way the corridors remained silent or the air carried the same quiet restraint it always had, but in something far subtler, something that revealed itself only when absence replaced expectation. Her door was closed. That, in itself, meant nothing. He would have passed by without pause, as he had passed countless others, had it not been for the faint sense that something was no longer where it should be, something he could not yet name. He stopped. It was not hesitation, not truly, but something closer to recognition forming too late to ignore, and after a moment that stretched longer than it should have, he reached for the handle and opened the door. The room was as it had been left, the bed undisturbed, the fire reduced to quiet ash, the curtains drawn back just enough to reveal the gray sky pressing against the glass. But it was not the presence of order that held his attention. It was the absence of something else entirely. She was gone. The realization did not arrive with force. It settled, slow and deliberate, as though the room itself confirmed it in silence rather than shock. And for a moment, he did not move, his gaze lingering on the space she had occupied, as though the imprint of her presence remained, faint but undeniable. Then he saw it. The letter rested on the desk, placed not carelessly, but with intention, as though it had been left not to be hidden, but to be found. He crossed the room without hurry, though the quiet control in his movements felt sharper now, more defined. And when he picked it up, the paper was still smooth, the ink fresh enough to suggest that time had not yet carried it far from her hand. He read it once, then again, though the words did not change, only the way they settled within him did, each line measured, each sentence restrained, yet carrying something that did not belong to courtesy alone. She had thanked him for shelter, for silence, for understanding. And in those simple acknowledgments, she had left behind something far more difficult to accept, the quiet certainty that she had chosen to leave before anything more could take hold. His hand lowered slightly, the letter remaining between his fingers as the room seemed to shift around him, not physically, but in a way that altered its weight, its stillness no longer untouched, but emptied of something that had, until this moment, gone unrecognized. He turned toward the window, the storm beyond it unrelenting, the path below already marked by wind and snow that erased all trace of passage, and for the first time since her arrival, he felt it clearly, not as thought, but as absence, the space she had occupied no longer filled by silence, but defined by it. She left at dawn. Mrs. Dalton's voice came from the doorway, quiet, but certain, and though he did not turn immediately, the words settled with finality. The roads are not yet safe. He knew that. It did not change anything. His gaze remained fixed beyond the glass, as though distance alone might reveal something that had already been lost. "Why was I not told?" he asked at last, his voice low, controlled, though something beneath it had shifted, something that no longer belonged entirely to composure. Mrs. Dalton did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice carried no defense, only quiet truth. She did not ask to be stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It held something sharper now, something that did not yield to reason or restraint. And as Sebastian stood there, the letter still in his hand, the realization settled fully, no longer distant, no longer unclear. She had not been sent away. She had chosen to leave. And in doing so, she had taken something with her that he had not realized he possessed until the moment it was gone. The storm had begun to thin, not enough to grant passage easily, but enough to reveal the shape of the road beyond the gates, faint beneath layers of snow and wind, and Sebastian did not hesitate as he stepped outside, the cold striking against him with a sharp clarity that cut through everything else. The letter remained folded in his coat, not as something he carried, but as something that had already taken hold, and with each step forward, the distance between what had been and what could still be narrowed into something that refused to be ignored. The path bore little trace of her passage, the storm having erased what it could, yet there were signs for those who knew where to look, a faint disturbance near the gate, the subtle shift of snow where footsteps had once pressed through, and he followed it without question, not because he was certain, but because turning back was no longer an option he recognized. The wind had softened, though it still carried enough force to make each step deliberate, and beyond the outer grounds, the road stretched into open land, its direction uncertain beneath the fading storm, but not entirely lost. She would not have gone far. She could not have. And yet the thought that she might continue forward, that she might reach a place beyond his reach, settled with a weight that moved him faster than reason alone could justify. It was near the bend in the road, where the trees thinned and the land opened into a stretch of quiet distance, that he saw her, a figure moving steadily against the wind, her steps measured, her posture unbroken despite the storm that had not fully released its hold. She did not turn immediately, as though she had already sensed that she was no longer alone, and when she finally did, her gaze met his with a calm that held no surprise, only understanding. "You should not be out here," she said, her voice steady, though the wind carried it away almost as quickly as it was spoken. Sebastian did not slow as he approached, the distance between them closing with a quiet urgency that did not need to be named. "Neither should you," he replied, his tone controlled, though the restraint within it had shifted, no longer distant, no longer untouched. She held his gaze, the space between them narrowing until there was nothing left but the quiet tension that had followed them since the moment she had crossed his threshold. "I left what needed to be said," she answered, her words measured, though something beneath them remained unresolved. He stopped a few steps away, close enough to see the faint traces of exhaustion she had hidden, close enough to recognize the weight of what she had chosen, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the storm around them fading into something distant, something secondary to what now stood between them. "You left before anything could change," he said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of the distance he had once relied on, and the truth of it did not accuse, but it did not retreat either. Clara's breath steadied, her gaze unwavering despite the quiet force of his words. "Some things should not change," she replied softly, though the certainty in her voice carried a question she did not ask. The silence that followed was not empty. It held everything that had not been spoken, everything that had begun to take shape without permission, and for the first time, Sebastian did not step back from it. "This place," he said, his voice quiet, but no longer restrained, "has held on to what it lost for far too long." His gaze did not leave hers. "I will not lose something I have just begun to understand." The words settled between them, not as command, not as expectation, but as truth. And in that moment, the distance that had once defined them shifted into something else, something fragile, something unspoken, yet no longer denied. Clara did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice carried the same quiet strength that had brought her there. But now it held something more, something that had not been there before. "Then do not try to keep it by force," she said, her words steady, but not unkind, "or it will become something you cannot hold." The wind moved softly around them, no longer harsh, no longer pressing, and for the first time since the storm had begun, the air felt still enough to carry what had been left unsaid. He did not reach for her. He did not ask her to stay, but he did not step away either. And in that stillness, something changed, not in certainty, but in choice, a beginning not claimed, but recognized. And as the storm finally began to clear, the path before them no longer felt like something that needed to be escaped, but something that might, at last, be chosen together.